Hello, everyone. My name is Sue Mosey, and I'm the president of Midtown Detroit, Inc. And I want to welcome all of you to our panel discussions that we're having related to our Cultural Center Planning Initiative. For those of you who may not be aware of this initiative, we have been working for about 18 months now with a fantastic design team, a number of local funding partners, and many of cultural center institutions on developing a connected physical plan for the Cultural Center District here in Detroit. So this includes landscaping overlays, lighting, mobility, stormwater, all kinds of other green infrastructure, as well as a digital transformational piece for the Cultural Center. And as a part of this, we're really excited to launch a new community engagement public platform for people to explore the district. And in association with that, 3 wonderful panel discussions that we're so happy that you have chosen to participate. So there is one panel discussion that's on green infrastructure, one on civic commons, and one also on public art. And we'd encourage you to take advantage of all of these if you can. And if you cannot, we're happy that you're joining us tonight. And we look forward to your participation and feedback. I want to thank all of the panel members, the outstanding group that we have assembled to really conduct these discussions with you, the public. And we would like to thank our staff people and our other consultant teams, including A. Kawaki and Agence Terre, as well as Root of Two and many others who are working with us to move forward this initiative. Thank you so much for joining, and we hope to see you back again tomorrow night for the next edition of the panel discussion.
Hello everyone, I'm Jean-Louis Farge of the studio Akoaki. I'm happy to be here at the launch of the CCPI.online platform. In the first phase of this project, our team produced an extensive analysis of site condition and institutional needs, and we're happy to share that work with you here.
Hello, I'm Anya Sirota of Studio Akoaki. In conjunction with the Going Public Conversation Series, we are rolling out CCPI.online, a digital platform designed to share the evolving planning process. We've envisioned this platform as an intuitive urban design tool to spark conversation about the district's possible futures. We hope you'll explore and offer your feedback.
Hello everyone, this is Olivier Philippe from Agence Terre in Paris. It is a wonderful experience working with a full range of institutions and people involved in this project. And as we pivot to the final phase of a guiding plan, we are delighted to continue refining the design with the district stakeholder institutions, the City of Detroit, residents, and the public.
And now for the main event. We will meet at the virtual Michigan Science Center for a conversation around the future of the Civic Commons, hosted by Director Christian Greer and moderated by Brian Boyer.
Hello, my name is Christian Greer, President and CEO of the Michigan Science Center, also known as MySci, where we put you at the center of science. Our aim is to get people to discover, explore, and pursue science and technology, engineering, and math, both for careers and general science and education knowledge. We do this in an informal education way at a facility that's based in Midtown, and we really want to get people connected to our creative and dynamic learning environment. I am very, very excited to participate in the Cultural Center Planning Initiative. You know, when you think about initiatives, they are designed to bridge those gaps in your strategy. And this is an opportunity for us to bridge a gap and connect people with our cultural center institutions. So I'm happy to host the Going Public Conversation series that's coming up, and you're going to be so excited to participate in this. We're going to have some great speakers and talk really deeply about what the future is for these organizations in Midtown and for the future of public engagement in Detroit and beyond.
And designer based here in Detroit, and I'll be moderating the panel this evening with a group of esteemed colleagues from Detroit, Philadelphia, and Ann Arbor, I believe. And so, sorry, in New York as well. I'm going to introduce the panel and then we'll jump right into the discussion. So in alphabetical order, we're joined tonight by Harley Etienne. Harley's career spans public policy and development in Philadelphia, as well as post-earthquake recovery in Haiti, and now teaching at the University of Michigan, where he's on the urban planning faculty. He's a regular author and editor, including the 2014 book, Planning Atlanta. And on top of all of that, Harley is one of the members of the design team that's been working to reimagine the cultural district here in Detroit, as Sue explained in the introduction. We are also joined by Ashley Flintoff, She's the Director of Planning and Space Management at Wayne State University, which is part of the Cultural District, and has around 30,000 students in Midtown. So not only is the physical location of Wayne State important, but all of those students and faculty members and the people of Wayne State are also really critical to the Cultural District. Ashley's focused on connecting Wayne State to the city beyond just the campus. So how do we integrate the campus and the community into Detroit at large? And she's recently been leading a master planning effort of her own there at Wayne State. Prima Gupta joins us from Philadelphia, where she is Vice President for Parks, Public Space, and Economic Development at the Center City District, which is downtown. She's worked all over Philly, from the Navy Yard to the University District, which gives me the sense when I'm there that if there's something interesting happening in Philadelphia in a public space, Prima's been part of it somehow. We are joined by George Jacobson, who is the Program Director for Southeast Michigan Economic and Cultural Vitality at the William Davidson Foundation. And he's been critical to launching this cultural center planning initiative that we're all here to talk about. And it's an example of his long history actually with arts and culture philanthropic work in Michigan that George has been involved in. And finally, Georgine Theodore, who is principal and co-founder of Interborough Partners, which is a Brooklyn and Detroit-based design studio. They work on a range of issues, from designing the Forest Park playscapes in St. Louis to master planning here in Hamtramck and Banglatown. And she's also the author of The Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion, a book about the failures and successes of public spaces around the country. So we hope to learn more about the successes than the failures. But tonight we're going to talk about the Civic Commons, which as a term might not mean much on its face. And so I wanted to give just a little bit of background there before we jump into it. When we think about the Civic Commons, you can imagine it's the stuff that we hold between us as members of a city, right? And so the things that are between us are physical spaces like Eastern Market and parks, but also streets and sidewalks, institutions like the library, the places where we come together. The things that are between us are also intangible, like the laws and regulations, the practices of the organizations that manage and maintain those public spaces. And so when we think about some of the most meaningful moments that we share together, we need both of those two pieces to come together, right? It's not just about high quality physical environments. You can have the most beautiful, inviting park that there is, but if there's somebody in that park that comes over and tells you what to do and tells you that you're doing things wrong or tells you that you're not welcome there, you're gonna run away. And likewise, you can have even the most basic kind of public space, but strong community, vibrant people can turn even just a plain old patch of grass into the best place to gather on a Wednesday afternoon and play soccer, for instance. And so what we're hoping to talk about today is that balance between the physical and the intangible, the kind of practices and the spirit that we have to bring to public spaces to turn them into something that's more than just a space or an open area, but really a kind of commons that we hold together and that brings us together. So I wanted to kick off the panel actually by stepping back even beyond public space and asking each of us to reflect briefly on any experience that you've had recently where you shared something with other people in a way that was meaningful to you. And so I was hoping that I could put Harley on the spot first to answer that question.
I'm glad to be here. I'm sorry, I hate to answer this question first because the past 9 months I haven't been sharing much of anything in a common space. But what I will say is that there have been moments, I think, for a lot of us in this year of challenge, that very innocuous kind of elements of our space have become much more important. And so porches and driveways in particular, as one of the only places that we can actually see people safely. In some cases, And so I would just kind of, an opening salvo here is that there have been some very meaningful, like just, I never thought I'd be so happy to see someone on their porch, as I have been in this past year, where it's something just you just kind of walk through and over, and don't really think about until you're in a moment like this, and then these communal spaces, even if it's just a driveway, become far more important than they were before.
Great, thank you. Ashley, what about you?
Well, thank you. That's a hard one to follow, Harley. But I think for me, and this is going to be hyper local, but I think for me, places like Detroit's Riverfront and the DeQuinder Cut. So I'm a runner, and on Saturday mornings, my neighbor who I've been, but we've been COVID potting together, go for a run, and we generally run down along the riverfront and up DeQuinder Cut. And the thing that really kind of made that poignant for me this summer was you couldn't be really close to people, but if you're running, you can keep that 6 foot distance. And there were so many people out in pairs or in singles, kind of walking or running or biking along these kind of public paths. And it really, it was the opportunity to connect with humanity without actually, connecting in ways that we did before. So that to me was just, it was really, really important to be able to go out and do that and see people from every walk of life across Detroit doing the same thing. And we could have those minute moments of real connection between each other. So.
I live near the DeQuinder Cut, and that has been a lifesaver, I have to say.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Inside. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Primo, what's an example of something that you've shared either this year or even we can go pre-pandemic as well that's been meaningful to you?
I'll kind of continue what Harley and Ashley have said. I mean, I think this year has just like really, you fill the void of not sharing, and you realize how meaningful and important it is. I keep thinking about a couple instances where, I'm just going back further. I mean, there's a study that says people that are happier, or like the happiness research tells you that if you interact with the person from whom you buy coffee, or the person who clicks your ticket on the train, and these sort of random, kind of not random, but I mean, that's sort of what builds community and what builds capital, I think, within a place. And I think the fact that we haven't had those in an extremely polarized time when we're all kind of spending a little much time, this not included, looking at screens. I think there's this void of sharing and this void of connectivity. And I think that we're really feeling the absence of that.
Yeah. George.
Thank you. And it is interesting to hear everyone's responses. And I think I might have answered your question several different times by now, Brian. From those interactions I used to have taking the bus, right? As Prima just mentioned, those just happenstance encounters. I have the benefit of really working with some very creative artists and individuals all across Detroit who work in the public realm and in the built environment. And the casual interactions or collisions between people, right, are always really exciting. And having seen them. But I will maybe veer into the COVID days. The one most striking experience, and maybe it was even more so because of how distant things have become, is one of our local organizations here, the Michigan Opera Theater, just had an amazing socially distant arts and cultural event where they produced an opera in the parking garage, and people moved through a parking garage. So I didn't really think we could have so many connections with the singers so close up who are staring at you in the face, to the dancers alongside of you, to just the experience of looking at people in their cars just with eyes wide open, right? It was so well executed, and it was a reminder of what was missing, but also this reality that I get to inhabit a lot, that Detroiters are inherently creative and the arts are incredibly important. And I think when we have, for me, those two things in combination, they're all of equal importance to me.
That's awesome. I saw some of the images from that performance, and unfortunately saw them after the performance had concluded. So I was sad to have missed it. Georgine, what's been meaningful to you lately in terms of shared experience?
Sorry. Well, I guess I live next to Prospect Park in Brooklyn, New York, which is a Olmsted design park, and I guess it's you could think that it's a kind of cliche answer to talk about the importance of parks, but I think that I've spent a lot of time there in the past 6 months, and honestly, I've come away really totally and excited about public space because I've seen
Hello, this is Sue.
this landscape be used in so many different ways. Like every morning there are, a whole bunch of preschools that have moved their classes outside. I see there's like impromptu jazz every night. There's yoga classes, like Zumba classes. 15-year-old birthday parties, fashion shoots. I've seen like absolutely everything. And I think that what's kind of interesting is it's not only the kind of stuff that you would normally imagine to be in a public space, like, people jogging, but because of COVID, a lot of things that normally would happen inside, like someone like lifting weights or, going to a dance class, or having a birthday party are actually happening in that space, and bringing together, multiple publics that don't really necessarily understand each other, but then are all of a sudden cohabitating in that space and not rubbing shoulders because we're all keeping 6 feet apart, but nonetheless are close to one another. And I think that the fact that a space like that has been able to handle that under this kind of pressure and kind of allow for all those different public practices to happen simultaneously, for me, has just been incredibly inspiring. And so I guess it just really points to the importance of well-designed, flexible spaces that allow different uses and publics to play out over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, the most flexible space is one that's completely empty, right? And so having outdoor spaces that are close and accessible to us give us the room to do things that maybe we couldn't predict in advance. And it's been interesting to see the parks and public spaces here in Detroit be utilized in new ways. I've seen a lot more people working outdoors, or just kind of spending longer durations of time in public spaces than maybe they would otherwise. As you all have been speaking, I've been taking notes and trying to pull out some of the qualities that you've identified as things that were meaningful to you. And so I wanted to just share those and then ask if we could maybe try to build on that list and add some other things that might help us define ultimately the outcomes, right? Like what are the qualities that something like the cultural district might seek to exhibit once this project has not only met the conclusion of the design phase, but ultimately the project has really been completed and the organizations are working together and really kind of delivering a new level of experience or let's call it a scene. Anya, who's one of the organizers of the work, often refers to the scene, right? And I really appreciate that. So what I heard was visibility, being able to see other things just on a very simple level. I heard also a certain level of activity, right? That you want to see other people in particular, not just a nice, beautiful landscape, but other humans. So that even if they're far away, they're 6 feet or more, that you know that you're not alone, you know that you're sharing something with others. There was a notion of loose connections that Prima brought up, which I think is really important, right? So opportunities for a quick hello or a little bit of banter back and forth remind us that we're social creatures, remind us that we're part of the civic realm or the social realm. And they also often are those moments where the unexpected comes up. And so that was another thing that was mentioned during the discussion is actually, Georgine, you were talking, I think, very beautifully about how there's no way you could have imagined all the things that were happening in the park that is right outside your door. And I think that's something that we crave or look for in public spaces is the opportunity to be surprised, by the unexpected. There's the role of the natural environment that's paying benefits to us as humans, but also to our non-human friends, and also to the infrastructure and the larger kind of municipal scale. Here in Detroit, stormwater is kind of consistent challenge. And so making sure that the natural environment plays a part in helping us deal with stormwater is important. And then there's a kind of just question, and maybe this is the flip side of the unexpected, but ingenuity, right? That not just surprising things are happening, but that it's like, oh, wow, I never expected that to be happening, but it's really exciting that it is. So what are the other things that come to mind? You know, you all work on the question of the public realm or public space, parks and other kinds of outdoor spaces from different angles. So what do you seek as the qualities that are most meaningful in terms of what you would offer to the people who come to those spaces after your work finishes?
I mean, I think, if I may, first of all, I think that was a brilliant list that you summarized. It was really well done. But, you know, the one thing that I might add to it is stewardship. And I think stewardship doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, the municipal government is picking up the trash. I think of it more as sort of a social stewardship. Somebody cares. I think a lot about a public space that, you know, I worked on. I think, Brian, this is where we first met 10 years ago, with movable tables and chairs. And how while walking through it once, I saw a broken one, and I picked up the broken chair, and I, you know, went to get on the subway, and 4 people stopped me and said, "You can't take that chair. Where are you going with that?" And I think just that somebody is looking out for the place. And again, some of it may be sort of governments and the actual operational aspects of stewardship, but I think just almost an emotional stewardship, I think is an important component of successful public spaces.
Let me just ask a question on that before we continue on this list. What did you say?
I think I was surprised. I hadn't, you know, been accused of stealing anything since I was a teenager. But I think I don't know. I think by the 3rd time I was annoyed, and I said, "I send me invoice for these chairs. I'm good. I work with the park." And I, you know, candidly, like I go back to that, and I just sort of, you know, I think that there's sort of layers of privilege embedded in sort of the dynamic of, you know, the people sort of, you know, and I think there's a lot to sort of unpack there that I don't think we have time to. But I think, yeah, it was interesting.
George.
You know, building on the notion of ships, the word that came most immediately to mind to me was ownership. And I think it actually plays hand in hand with the notion of stewardship as well, especially in I think in this particular, you know, community where you've seen the fortunes rise and fall and ebb and flow for various levels of stewardship. But what has been pretty consistent, at least in a neighborhood context, is the ownership people have for their spaces, the community volunteer groups or the block clubs that take care of the public spaces and parks. And I think when it comes to the visibility components of the potentially major draws, it's that notion of the space belongs to everybody also. Now there's a critical function of that stewardship, but that one would feel just as comfortable in that space as another person, I think is a critical factor to the success of these types of districts and spaces.
So we're talking about ownership, maybe is it fair to say on an emotional level, rather than like literally I own that thing?
I mean, that's a whole other movement, right? Of how to share equity. That's a different conversation. But yeah, I think in the emotional, you had a great list too. I mean, I think that is a really key component of it. People feel connected, and people feel it's their space.
Yeah.
So that's actually what I was going to actually add was the word emotion. Prima said it first. You know, I think we haven't really engaged the photos that we have scrolling, but one of the ones some of you may recognize, Reforma dos, which is a shopping mall in the center of Mexico City. That's a picture from a really particular moment from a trip I was taking there during the World Cup, and this mall with thousands of people in it came to a standstill to watch this game together. And you could have heard a pin drop, they were losing. But there was one man who was very angry about the performance of the national team and wanted to make sure the thousands of people there in the mall knew it. we got to share that moment together. And so this kind of collective sadness, about this loss, which I had seen a few days earlier when they had eliminated Sweden and they were ready to tear the place apart, that kind of in the same block. And so I think that to go from the happy to the joyous to the sad to the commemorations, designers can create the space, but then it's how people get attracted to it and then use it for these other purposes, like these emotional attachments to the place, that I think are critically important.
Yeah, and to build on that, I think the thing that popped into my head was really accessibility. And accessibility has a couple of different, it can mean a couple of different things. We can mean accessible just from the perspective of physical accessibility, but I think also kind of this emotional accessibility. One of the things that we work on and really are working towards with our campus is we're a public campus, we're an open campus, there are no fences, there are no walls, but how do our buildings and how do our physical environments actually engage almost imperceptibly with the public? So we've had in our master planning process, we had comments that say, yeah, there's no walls, but I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel like I can walk through the campus, which is incredibly sad to me, and it makes me want to immediately go and like turn things around them and turn them upside down to make sure that people feel they can access our campus. But I think for really effective public spaces, it's that everyone feels that they're welcome there, that they can go there, but they also feel accepted because they see others like themselves, right? So if you can see yourself in the space, then you're more likely to use it. And so it's this constant question of who are we designing the space for? And I think as designers, we have a tendency to want to kind of be a little bit more prescriptive around, well, you're going to want to do this thing in this space, and so I'm going to design it this way. And I think we have to kind of stop ourselves and step back and say, I'm not designing it for me, I'm designing it for the broader public. And so that's always the question that we try to keep in mind.
I think that's really nicely put, Ashley. There's been a growing discussion around infrastructure in the US as we see our physical infrastructure kind of reaching the end of its life in a number of places. But also as we see the kind of social ties that typically bind us starting to get stretched, if not fray, there's a renewed conversation around social infrastructure and the way in which not just the place of a museum or the place of a library or a university, but the activities there and the people who are drawn to those activities can pull others in. And I think this is maybe a good opportunity then to ask Georgine about a little bit the work that you've been doing, looking at inclusion and exclusion around the country. I'm wondering if you have any examples or something that you could pull in here that would show us a little bit about the way that the physical and the social work together to create a place that's welcoming and inclusive. And you're muted.
Sorry about that. So that's such an interesting question. And as other people were speaking, I think it's an interesting balance between feeling like you have a place and that you feel welcome, but at the same time that public space recognizes difference. And so for me, I think when I think about public space, heterogeneity is really, really, really important. And so I think that is something that I think about a lot in design. And so often when we are working in public spaces, we try to take lessons from how people already use space, but also to think about how infrastructure can be appropriated in many, many different ways in order to draw in different groups. So I think that one of the images that was in that set was of Lent Space, which is a public space that we did many years ago, where we were actually required to design a fence because of the legality of it. There had to be a fence, but we made the fence actually rotate, and it had a window and it had a bench. And so all of a sudden you actually didn't really know what it was, but it could be used in many different ways and also kind of attract different groups. And so because some people wanted to sit there, other people wanted to sort of, you could put art on it and so on. So I think that this one, on the one hand, trying to encourage heterogeneity and difference, and then and doing that through designing things that can be appropriated in many different ways, I think is a good is an approach that I certainly embrace.
Yeah, this question of appropriation or people reinterpreting the things that are in front of them, doing, having the feeling like they have the permission or feeling like it's perfectly welcome for them to do something that nobody told them that they should or could do. It seems like such an elusive quality. If I could condense that down to one or two words, I would put it on this list that I have, but unfortunately I don't have a succinct way to say it.
Just try designing for college students. College students are really, really good at appropriating infrastructure and spaces and things in a million different ways that you did not even think of. I mean, I have so many projects where, we're walking through with a designer or a manufacturer for furniture, and I'll say, well, can it stand up to this? And they look at me and I say, yeah, it's college students. I know they're going to do this, right? So, yeah.
You could say the same thing about small children. I mean, maybe a way of summarizing it is sort of an improvisational program. It's not whatever the opposite of a prescriptive program is.
That's another thing. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Georgine, please.
No, you go ahead, Harley.
I was just going to say, I think that there is accessibility, and then there's kind of trying to think about the intimate and the broad in terms of inclusion. So, sometimes in a public space, you just need to peel off. So since I'm a member of the design team and work with them, I'll just say, the necklace concept does that exact thing, is that you can have this square kind of figure in the space that allows people to traverse and kind of get between institutions fairly easily. But then you do want the smaller, more intimate spaces where you can kind of peel away from the kids or the college students or what have you. Because we often look for both, that even when we're in the middle of Times Square or the middle of great plazas, we do want a little bit of intimacy at the same time. We want to be in it and of it, but also a part. And so that can cut both ways in terms of accessibility, in terms of justice and access to space. I mean, we want to give people ownership, but not so much ownership that they can actually drive exclusion.
I think that's an excellent point, Harley. And it strikes me again, going back to the Dekendra Cut as one of the earlier examples. Here in the Dekendra Cut, we have little benches and there's some outdoor workout equipment and things like that. So there are points of punctuation along that experience that allow people to have whatever duration and pace makes sense to them. And so that might be another aspect of this, is that some people, the cultural district straddles Woodward. Like some people are going to be like blasting right through there and they're not going to stop. They're going to be stopped at a stoplight and that's all they're going to experience of the district for that day. And that's fine. But other people are going to be there for an exhibition at the DIA. And then what else are they going to do or experience as they're moving into and out of that building? How do we start to expand the experience and the connections that they have? How do we start to, link together perhaps the different things that are available to them across the 12 institutions that are there, so that it's not just a kind of, consumption of one-offs, but actually turning into making a day of it or making a larger experience. I'm curious, if we think about the role of those organizations that I just named, some of the DIA, Wayne State, Michigan Science Center, our host for the evening. When we think about asking them to work together, this is something that I'll be the person that says this, is not historically the way that museums and libraries and universities think about the world often. And so I think there's some, kudos go to these groups for asking the question. And I'm curious if the panelists have any examples or maybe some reflections on where you've seen organizations partnering together to create really powerful experiences. They could be public space experiences or something else completely, like George's example around the opera, for instance, which is only temporarily outdoors. But what are you seeing in terms of organizations working together that might give us some points of hope for the journey that the cultural district groups are about to embark upon?
I'm sorry, I hate awkward silences. But I would just say, and I'm saying this as working with the design team, that I think that there is both the existing infrastructure that's there, that's really clear. And so the 1967 exhibit that crossed the Detroit Public Library, the Detroit Historical Museum, there are these moments where, okay, we're commemorating 1967, and so multiple institutions can have exhibits or different things that commemorate that moment. The DIA, shameless plug, is their art of design exhibit right now, featuring cars that were designed here in Detroit. I think is really important, and there's opportunities to kind of cross and encourage people to leave the DIA and go across the street to see the Detroit Historical Museum's long-running exhibit about car manufacturing. So I think that there are moments to do this, and I was hoping, when we lost Aretha Franklin a few years ago, that all the institutions would say, okay, let's find some way to mark her impact on the city's landscape, whether it's piping music or, and some of them did. My Sci was handing out water to people who were waiting in line to pay their respects. I mean, there were lots of ways in which that can happen. But I think there's this other invisible layer that the institutions in working on this project haven't even seen, that one of the most important institutions for Wayne State is the upstairs gallery in the Detroit Public Library, because Wayne State students use it as a date space. They go on Friday night dates there. And when there are events at my side, they go for cocktails on the roof at my side. So I think there's some way to kind of see those invisible ways in which these institutions are highly connected and don't even recognize how interconnected they are, and figuring how to play up on those connections between themselves.
I think one of the layers to the work in Detroit, which is really important to note, is at least for me and my perspective, is the number of new leaders of the organizations coming into their positions at roughly the same time. That was not intentional, far from it, for any of the organizations, but to have Christian at the Science Center, Neil Barclay at the Charles H. Wright, Don Tusky at CCS. You go down the list, new leaders confronting new challenges, and took positions in Detroit perceived to be much, I think rightly in some ways, on an upswing. That it's an exciting place to be. It's arts led, and so as new leaders, we've seen some very creative projects. I think. This might be in my time in philanthropy and working in the arts field, pretty much the only time I've seen this consistent level of engagement on an initiative from any more than two organizations working together across any number of sectors. And I think it's a credit to not just them, but also, and maybe this is to your question, Brian, more specifically, having a intermediary partner or some neutral space that's advocating for the quality of space and the quality of access. And for us in this district, it's Sue Mosey and Midtown Detroit Inc.'s expertise. They understand the city dynamics and work with the city partners quite effectively. They communicate the messages to their district stakeholders and partners, and are able to convene. And that helps also, having some of the opportunity to do something new and different, to stretch, to not be burdened by historic biases in some way, shape, or form, or inertia, I guess, and to have that entity or sets of entities that can have that convening power for people to get together and really vet the idea whether it's worthwhile to pursue.
And I think along those lines, I'm sorry, Brian.
No, please, go for it.
George, I completely agree. And I think one of the things too that you can do that I've seen actually very recently with the Cultural Center be very effective is building on kind of small wins for collaboration. So, the institutions all started getting together and talking at the beginning of this process, this planning process, and kind of having everyone at the table. Everyone was really commenting, this is really powerful, this is really great. And then COVID hit. And if we're going to try and find a silver lining somewhere, not to downplay any of the horrificness of COVID, but I think what I saw happen was all of a sudden, all of these institutions were saying, oh, wait a minute, we had some really powerful moments at the beginning, we're having some really powerful moments in this cultural center planning initiative. Let's build upon that. And Midtown, gathered everyone together and brought in consultants and brought in people to help the institutions try to figure out, how do we deal with COVID? How do we respond to it? Sanitation, safety, all of these things. And it started to really build on that community. So the first kind of initial win of, oh, everyone actually came to the table and we're having really meaningful conversations, and then building on it with okay, well, here's a crisis, and now let's all pull together and start to work together again. I think what you're doing is you're building that connective tissue. You're really kind of strengthening that, so that as we kind of move into the next phase or the next thing that needs to happen, we have that foundation that's really starting to be much stronger than it maybe was before. So
I like the ability to see the silver lining in all of this 2020-ness that we've been dealing with.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, it really, I think it's really important, as George mentioned, that there's somebody that can play the role of starting the party. And I think it also takes a certain level of courage. So a friend of mine who does community organizing work in Chile once said to me that the person who pays for the party doesn't get to choose the music, which I thought is this really lovely way of describing that conveners are so important, but to convene is not to plan and to design. It takes a humility and a trust that if you have the right people at the party, it's going to be a good scene. And so I think, again, it does speak to the quality and the character of the organizations and their important role in the city, and the leadership that is at the helm of each of those organizations. And it's going to, I think, continue, Ashley, as you're describing, that bond that's been formed is going to, it's going to be needed because realizing this project it's not exactly going to be easy, but the benefits potentially are huge. And so hopefully there's enough to pull people through. I wanted to ask Prima if you can reflect a little bit on your experiences in Philadelphia around this notion of different organizations working together, and with a particular angle on it, which is Center City District, downtown Philly. You have government, you have massive corporations, you have a market that's in or near the district. So you have huge players and tiny players, but somehow you all are trying to get them to think about themselves as a collective or as a group. So when you have like a David and a Goliath in the same room together, how do you get them to see that they each have something to give or some value to give to each other?
We have this really complicated algorithm that we run every decision through, and it equally weighs everyone's perspective, and it spits out the perfect happy response that makes everybody happy. No, there's no way to do it. It's messy. And I think the way to do this is getting people around a table and getting throwing ideas out and getting heads nodding. I think that's the only way to do it. So I think, it sounds like you have an incredibly talented design team here thinking about this stuff, and clearly some very smart people, but just throwing out ideas and seeing what gets people's, consensus. And I'm a big believer in words and writing. I hate jargon. I don't mean it that way, but I mean just creating a shared vision statement that, again, a large group of folks agree on, I think is a really important step. And then from there, I think operationalizing it is a completely different story. And I think that's in some ways the really difficult part. And I think it can be really helpful to have, somebody said it, I apologize, I can't remember who, but having these separate entities whether it's at the Midtown organization, University City District, Center City District in Philadelphia. But, I think it's really hard when you have a lot of mission-driven organizations who are, especially in the environment that we're looking at for 2021, people are trying to keep their lights on, people are trying to keep their staff. And just to focus on something that is not clearly like core mission, I think is really hard, which is why I think you need someone else doing it with the buy-in of these larger groups. I think about this example. So I had done this very pop-up, very minimally intensive public space in West Philly. And we met with the Philadelphia Art Museum because they were interested in doing something like this. And so my boss at the time and I went and met with the president of the Art Museum and the chief operating officer. And we just said oh, it's really easy. Just buy tables and chairs, get some planners, cheap, easy, done. And I always think back to that conversation and how they had sort of no way of operationalizing that because they are running one of the best art museums in the world. And that's just not what they do, and who would do it, and how would that fit into a really complicated org chart? So I do think it's really important to have someone else do it that, again, represents all of these organizations, somebody with perhaps a background in diplomacy who can kind of manage, the size and scale and frankly, the checkbooks of these various groups. But I do think it's really the intermediate organizations are absolutely the way to go to operationalize this stuff.
That's great. One of the things I heard in what you were saying is the idea of co-creating the agenda between the organizations around a shared table, which right now is a little bit complicated. Are you doing those kinds of conversations through Zoom calls, or do you have some other magic approach to it in this particular moment?
No, I think it's all messy right now. I think we are trying to do it through Zoom calls. I think we're trying to do it. I think your first step is sort of a visual language and looking at pictures of what people are doing and what, I think in Philadelphia, I think of Philadelphia sort of as the East Coast Detroit. I think we're very competitive and have a bit of a chip on our shoulder, as you may or may not have heard. But, just looking at examples of what is Brooklyn doing, what is Detroit doing, what is Charlotte doing, looking at examples, and I think tapping into people's competitive spirit about what other places are doing and why they're doing it better and why can't we have those. So I think starting with the visual is really helpful, and looking at sort of precedents, which is a fancy way of saying examples from other places, looking at those. And then I think just trying to pull out what are the themes, what are the ideas of, what could the focus be? And, again, as you said, Brian, shared agenda, just ideas, like a paragraph, a precis, just documenting what everyone kind of agrees on, and then going from there. And then again, thinking really thoughtfully about what the entity is that operationalizes all of this, because that really is the hard part.
And what I heard as well was remembering that at the end of the day, some things can be quick and simple.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Sometimes you can just throw a few chairs without going through a whole elaborate process. Although, of course, procurement, how we actually buy this stuff, sometimes ends up being the biggest battle of it all.
Yeah, and I think a part of that is, so I worked for a period of time in public-private real estate development. So I was the public entity, and we worked with for-profit developers of different scales. And I think that the key to making those things work, in addition, it's helpful if you trust each other and you like each other, but just really clarifying roles and responsibilities and who does what. And to your point, Brian, somebody in that kind of maze of folks is going to have a more streamlined procurement process than perhaps others.
Right. Okay. So I think I just want to lift that up a little bit, because, we're talking about, you have all sorts of different organizations at different sizes and with different internal processes. So even if you come together and you co-create an agenda, what you want to do together, you can be creative about who takes on which part of it, so that you do it in a way that has the lightest or lowest level of bureaucratic overhead. I think of kind of tax, if you will, that bureaucratic process puts on things, often with the best intentions, right? Trying to make sure that we do things properly, that things are above board. All of those are really important intentions, but sometimes they also become a crutch to take away the ambition of actually doing stuff and doing it quickly. And so I think your point there about not letting ourselves fall into those habits of just saying, oh, it's too hard, is one potential source of strength that we have when we have all sorts of different groups together. Somebody's got an easier way to do it, inevitably. This question of co-creation that we just talked about at the level of kind of goals or vision, I'm struck by the way in which actually everything that we design, despite what architects and urban planners try to do, it's still ultimately co-created by the people that use it, right? And so I know the most forward-thinking designers that I know of, including groups like Akoaki and Agence Terre, who are working on this project, and then folks like Interborough, where Georgine is a partner and co-founder, are thinking about engagement in the design process itself. And so I'm wondering, Georgine, if you can share some thoughts about how co-creation is part of bringing people into something like the cultural district in Detroit, so that they have that emotional ownership from the very beginning of the process.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
My internet went glitched out for a moment, but before jumping into that question, I wanted to just, I was still thinking about what you were saying with the last round of questions, and this condition of fragmentation, like say like institutional fragmentation that you're facing, potentially facing here. I mean, I think it's something that really characterizes our whole condition in the United States. Like, I think that like the questions that you're facing here are central to our time. And as we tackle these kinds of issues, it's like we're creating new approaches that are so just so valuable, because that's where we kind of need to bring our design thinking, is how to kind of break down those boundaries. And I think that, making a two-pronged approach really makes a lot of sense, like to think about what are the ways to, organize the different entities and stakeholders, and to bring people around the table, as was said before. But I think there's room for like a kind of a two-pronged approach, I think, which is also with in addition to sort of thinking about how to bring everybody together and to create a new framework, also just to sort of sometimes to take, not obsess about permanence, and to actually experiment a little bit. I'm thinking a little bit about a project that I spent several years of my life working on, which was the Rebuild by Design competition, which was tackling questions of how to like rebuild after Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast. And this is at kind of a larger scale, but like, how do you design kind of shared things, like shared infrastructure, in a condition of extreme fragmentation? In this case, municipal fragmentation. Like every single town needs, wants to do something different. And I think that in the case of that project, through doing some things on the shorter term, allow people to kind of maybe lift some of the some of the things that would be sticking points to making kind of longer term solutions. And there have been many examples of that around the world. Like, I also think about, like, say the IBA in the Ruhr Valley that was done 15 years ago, 20 years ago, where through doing temporary projects, people are saying, like, well, okay, maybe we can't do it in the long term, but yeah, for this one time we can do it. So I think especially when it comes to the public realm, to try to take a two-pronged approach, one, sort of thinking about what the long-term solution is, but then also experimenting in the short term can be, I think, an interesting way to test those boundaries, and to identify new ways of create new alliances and new shared objectives.
Thank you for that. I mean, in a way, what you just described is actually a form of co-creation, right? It's finding a way to create a feedback loop between a guess or a hypothesis about what's gonna be suitable or supportive or just positive for a community. And then saying, let's try the quickest, easiest, fastest way we know to test this. And if the feedback comes back positive, then we figure out how to grow it. And if it doesn't, we figure out how to change course. Again, I think I'm sure we've all experienced in different ways the kind of tension between that human desire to do things quickly and easily, and some of the systems that we participate in that don't always work the same way, to put it politely. We're getting some questions from the audience, and so I wanted to pull in one of these. We'll see kind of how much time, maybe one question, maybe two. But one of the things that is coming up is going back to, I think, a thread that Harley introduced early in the conversations around being genuinely welcoming, being inclusive. And what are the ways in which, or is it possible for digital tools to help us accomplish that goal? Are you all seeing uses of technology that make spaces or make public experiences more inclusive, more diverse, more welcoming?
I guess since you mentioned me, I'll jump in. Yes, but I think there are limits. And so I think that technology can do some wonderful things like the panel that we're on at this very second, and that it can bring people together. And there are lots of things we can talk about, kind of interactive exhibits at the different institutions. We can think about wayfinding, lighting, sound, Wi-Fi. There are lots of things that we can think about what technology does. At the same time, I think that where we started this conversation is that people long to be together. And so I think in that way, urban space still matters. Urban design and good design still matters. And I actually think post-COVID, it will matter much more because we're going to be longing for this time to get together. We're going to need spaces where it's still safe because we're not going to be out of the woods for a while. And so we're going to need spaces that can accommodate people and also be safe places to congregate and that have meaning. And I think that there's something to be said for using technology, as much as we can, but also understanding its limits in its ability to facilitate real and genuine human interactions.
Thank you, Harley. Ashley, what do you guys do at Wayne State to make sure people even just know about what's happening on campus? How do you draw people in using digital tools?
So that's a great question, and it's hard to follow Harley always, but we've actually, yeah, I know. We've actually really been working on this question because of COVID. So, how do you take what is normally for students, for most students, I mean, the biggest part of the college experience is physically being in a separate place, interacting with different people, different experiences, all of these things, like that is the quintessential college experience. And so when you all of a sudden say, guess what, you're not going to be able to do that in the same way that you would before, you're not going to actually physically get to meet all of these people and be in these spaces. How do you address that? How do you still create that college experience for students, or create those feelings of connection when their whole world has just been turned upside down? And so that's something that we've really been struggling with and working on. I will say that our marketing team and our student success team and our Dean of Students office are amazing, quite frankly. And they've done everything from virtual tours to game nights and cooking demonstrations and art things where you come pick up your supplies and then you go back to your room or to your home or whatever. And, there's a virtual, like everyone's painting together, everyone's kind of decorating that mug, or, they've done drive-through kind of swag bags, little sign, like yard signs that say like Wayne State Satellite Campus that you can put in your front yard. So there's a lot of different kind of cross-sectional interactions that we've been trying to create to give students that same experience. And it's been difficult, I'll have to say. Like it's hard because, like Harley said, you really, you still want that interaction. You still want that personal kind of face-to-face experience. And so, there's been a lot of talk about how do we cope with it. There's been a lot of, we did a mental health day actually for the entire campus to just say, look, if you need to take a break, like we understand, we get it. I don't know that we necessarily have an answer, but I think that we've been trying out a lot of things, and especially for an large institution like ours, if anyone's familiar with higher ed, it's hard to get higher ed to kind of pivot quickly on anything. But to Georgine's point, the ability to be able to kind of test things out, I think we've seen that come into play during COVID, and it's actually been super successful. Even when it's failed, or hasn't, not failed necessarily, but hasn't turned out the way we thought, it's this opportunity to learn from those experiences that has really been very, very important for us. So I think it's a constant learning experience, but it's interesting for sure.
Right. If I could add maybe a couple quick things. It's a little bit more than beyond the realm of public space stewards. We have a series of arts and cultural organizations also in the district who have to grapple with engagement in general. And I think during the crisis, while there was a lot of emphasis on how do you invite people back in safely, some of the organizations have really leaned in hard on an area where arts and cultural nonprofits, just generally speaking, aren't really strong, and that's on digital engagement. So whatever the future looks like post-COVID, or just as COVID we were able to move about more safely, I have this question in my head: what is the role of an arts and cultural organization going forward? No matter if they're a history museum, a gallery, this role for digital engagement. There's capital being invested in it right now, and there's being skills invested in it right now. And it's part of a broader movement in the field that I think in some ways COVID has hastened. And some organizations in Detroit actually were pretty well positioned to lean on that, given some history and expertise. The DSO, Detroit Symphony Orchestra, for example. They're not in this cultural district specifically, but they're a very close by partner. They've been working with digital audiences and digital technologies far beyond any other orchestra in this country. Their message, they're the most accessible orchestra. And I use that just as one example. This is something that we have artists who work in these spaces. We have artists that work in these mediums. We have content creators all across the board who are thinking about these questions. And it's an exciting moment to think about what this future could look like, while we all try to return to some sense of normalcy. But what's that layer of digital future on top of it?
George, I think that's a beautiful reminder that at the end of the day, what we're talking about here are relationships between people and institutions, between people and places, and between people and other people. And we maintain those relationships through physical experiences, through digital experiences, through mementos and trinkets, through memories. And that all of those can be part of the way that we think about the future of the district here. I want to invite maybe quickish comments. If we can go back to the question of emotional ownership, because the audience questions that we're getting are about if we have any real concrete examples of how you make a space open to emotional ownership by a diverse public. If there are any thoughts off the top of your head that would answer that question, let's do a quick round. Otherwise, maybe we'll move into final reflections.
I think we shouldn't sell ourselves short in this community on the talent that lives here, the creative talent that lives here to help solve through some of those questions. The artists here are phenomenal. We have a lot of talented administrators. I think the sector here is up for figuring this out. And we have a lot of ways in which to learn. I mean, the public library has 21 branches across the city of Detroit. That's a layer of insight and knowledge that I think could be very beneficial to help to further explore this question too.
I think to build on that a little bit, it's listening. It's listening to the folks that are already there, that are already in the space, already using the space, to understand what they feel about it, how they interact with it, how they want to interact with it. A lot of times projects come in and with even the best intentions kind of come in and say, we're going to prescribe what this space really needs to like bring it up to speed or renovate it or to do whatever. And you end up excluding the folks that already had a built-in an emotional ownership or emotional attachment to those spaces. So I think it's really being open to listening and honestly incorporating the input of the folks that are already there. That doesn't mean you can't invite others in and new folks in, but don't ignore who was already there to begin with.
Actually, I'm going to follow you this time, Ashley. I love that you said the word open, but I was going to say open in a different sense, to just stay open, both in a logistical sense and then in a conceptual sense. So I think some of the spaces that I care most about are the ones that are just open 24 hours a day, like in terms of plazas and open spaces, but then the institutions and the businesses and other things that surround those spaces that are open as late as possible. And so there's something about kind of having this multi-shift experience with a space, like it's the place that you run past in the morning, or the place that you go to an exhibit for, or that you stay and have a glass of wine at until 10 p.m. Or later. And so I think that this is about saying yes more than you say no to new ideas and to accommodating new audiences and constituents. It can't be what you've always done. It can't be who you've always talked to and engaged with. It's got to be just much more open and dynamic relationship with everyone.
Primo or Georgine, do you have anything to add on this question of how do you create emotional ownership or examples that you've seen of that working in cities?
Can I answer the previous question instead and take a very strong anti-technology stance when it comes to placemaking in public spaces? I mean, this is fine, but like, I'm going to talk to Harley about Philadelphia and I'm going to go on a run with Ashley. It's not the same. And I think as we think about 2021 and beyond, we need to sort of create platforms for people to make eye contact and interact. This is not a substitute. This makes things worse. This makes us more polarized. This makes us think of each other in shorthand even more. So I'm old school. Like I'm a Luddite. I get it, but like I think that's like public spaces are the antidote to all of this, and they do like break down barriers, and they're sort of an empathy building exercise as opposed to like a dopamine hit. So I think it's so important. I mean, I personally don't believe public spaces should have Wi-Fi because I think like look up from your phone. It's beautiful. They're people. It's great. So I mean, just sort of that. I mean, I think that's like a really, in my opinion, a really important way to think about these things. So I know it's not the current question, but it's something that I feel pretty strongly about.
We'll take it.
So I'll answer the second question. And I would like to build on what Ashley said about listening. And I think that in cases like this, where we're looking to kind of build a kind of spatial and social infrastructure that brings people together, I think that the best place to start is by listening, but also by observing and trying to build in the practices of how people already use space, to use the kind of the traditions and the practices that people have and use that as the kind of raw material for a future space. And so so that it could come back in a surprising way, but I think nonetheless, you want to integrate those things into the process because that will make it much more robust. Not exclude anybody else, but I think you should, the best public space designs build on the things that are already there.
Great, thank you, Georgine. Let's go and just do a round of final thoughts. And I'd ask you to think of this as, anything that you wanted to slip into this conversation that you didn't have a chance to, and or any advice you have for this team that's going to continue working beyond this panel and the next two, beyond the morass of 2020. They're going to be carrying for some time. And so any advice you have for them around the topics that we spoke about today? So maybe I'll start with George and put you on the spot first.
Sure, I'll try to be pretty brief on this one. I think, if it's a bit of a reflection, it's first gratitude for everyone that's here. This has been a phenomenal conversation to listen to, and thanks for your moderation, Brian. This has been great. I think the second is, this is not a near-term, this project doesn't end, right? This is there's conclusion of elements of work, but in my mind, what the opportunity really is taking the culture that exists within the community and establishing a new language to advance elements of culture in place. And that's going to be like a forever job that someone needs to be thinking about all of the time. Just that's how to build these connections, how to make sure that there's the emotional ownership, the attachment to place, and all of the right dimensions to it. But it is, to me, it's a long-term project that's not even 5-10 years in the making. It's longer than that. These institutions have been around decades, and it's setting a new template for how it operates in the future.
Thank you. Ashley.
Oh goodness, I always have to follow the really great comments. I think for me, it's a lot, I'm gonna repeat myself a little bit. It's a lot about listening. I like Georgine's use of the word observation. I think for me, the most effective public spaces and the most effective kind of experiences in the public realm really happen organically. They really happen when you stop and you kind of observe what's going on, you listen to what's going on, and it's not prescribed, it's not overly programmed. I think we have a tendency, and it's probably human nature, to kind of want to, well, you're going to do this, and then we're going to have this program, we're going to have this thing for you to do, and you kind of jump from thing to thing, and we don't take a moment to kind of step back and experience those really organic and interactions or just moments in life. So I think the thing for me is really going to be, that balance of how do we create spaces that allow everyone to come in and use these, use the space the way that they want to create their own experiences and have interactions in ways that they're really not even maybe looking for. So I don't know if I said that as eloquently as I meant to in my head, but I think it's allowing people to create the spaces that they want it to be.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. Harley, what would you contribute?
I will just say that I start every introductory class in urban planning with the definition that planning is the organization of hope. And that you should really, to the leaders of the stakeholder institutions, to think about the hope and applying an agenda and an itinerary to that hope. This shouldn't just be something opaque and bland, like we hope there are more people here. Be audacious. Hope that this is going to be a world-class destination that people will talk about. Like, have you seen what they did in Detroit with their cultural district? Let that be the thing that organizes your energy. And what will sustain, just to George's point, what will sustain this over the next decade or more as this project gets built out. And I think without hope, it doesn't work.
Very eloquent. Georgine.
I guess I wanted to just point to two kind of amazing potentials. I think that with this topic and with this project of thinking about the civic commons and with shared spaces, I think we're at a moment in history where these spaces are more important than ever. I think the COVID crisis has laid that bare. All of the kind of the rightful protests with the Black Lives Matter movement in the over the past spring and ongoing. I think spaces in which people can come together are so crucial, and taking them on with this project and having this kind of conversation is just the right step forward. And so I think putting the design thinking into coming up with creative solutions and getting this done, I think is, not only important for this district, but it's also just really important precedent for things that people face all over the country. And then I also think that if there's there's two opportunities here. One about kind of addressing the kind of polarization that we all experience, but also I think that there's a kind of an ecological and sustainability opportunity here. I think the way that most of the built environment in the United States was built, say in the mid-century onwards, was really thinking about each institution and each space designed unto itself, or even just think about the way that shopping malls are designed, that you have you have your building and then you have its own parking lot. Thinking about finding spaces where people can share the uses is the most ecological thing that we can do. So I think that there's just really a social, but also an ecological component to this kind of project that just puts, just makes it really full of opportunity and makes me full of hope also, because these are the kinds of projects that we should be pursuing right now.
Thank you. And Prima, what are your thoughts?
Shorten the gaps. And by that, I mean, in a very physical and practical way. And I should go back. I mean, I haven't been to this area in a couple of years. I can't remember when the ULI conference was in Detroit, but I obviously made my pilgrimage to see the Diego Rivera murals. But I remember an area with a lot of a formal plan and buildings that were very far apart. And what can you, you all have described a lot of institutions of different scales and different resources. What can be brought outside? What can really engage with the public? And how can you shorten the distances literally and sort of psychologically between places just by creating sort of playful interactions between objects or programs from the different institutions. I mean, I think again, the theme that, I'm so inspired by from this conversation is I think we're all just craving this connectedness and being together again. But I do think that what eccentric juxtapositions can you create with these wonderful array of institutions that you have in this area, and how can you just make things feel closer together? So I mean, shorten the gap. I mean, just create more connectivity and bring things, whether it's objects or programs, outside.
This is great. It's been such a privilege to have this conversation this evening with all of you. I've been adding to my list as we've been going. So I'm going to do the second round now, and we'll see if we feel that this is starting to get somewhere as a recipe for what we might hope for from the cultural district. So just as a recap, we talked about visual connections. We talked about activity, loose connections between people, the unexpected, and the flip side of that, which is ingenuity. We talked about being open to things happening organically and evolving over time, and literally organically with nature, the importance of nature as part of our built environment, as something that helps us respond to the climate challenge as well. We talked about stewardship and ownership. We talked about tone setting, making sure that we're welcoming people in a genuine way, but without being policing. About improvisational programming. We talked about difference and heterogeneity. So how do we make this a place that it's not only filled with different types of activities and different types of people, but that it's overwhelmingly obvious that that's the nature of the place, right? That that's what's celebrated. That happens hopefully in more pockets than in gaps, to bring up the example from Prima. That we do it through a process of listening and observing, that we think about multiple paces and multiple different timelines of all the many people who live, work, study, and move through this district, about saying yes more than we say no, about less dopamine, more empathy, about having a high level of ambition, thinking about this not just as something that can be a really fantastic moment in Detroit, but a reason for people to come to Detroit, right? That this could be something that is as meaningful to everywhere outside of Detroit as Motown, as techno, as our other things that we like to pride ourselves on here. And I think perhaps the most important reminder of all of this is that none of this work ever stops. There's not a done condition as we strive towards any of these goals. So with that, I just want to say thank you again to all the panelists and also to the organizers of the event. And just remind folks, as you heard in the introduction, that there's another panel tomorrow and one shortly after that, that'll focus on the public art question and the role of public art in these kinds of spaces, and also the role of green infrastructure. So we'll kind of drill down into or get closer to those two topics in the following panels. Thank you very much.
Hello again. This is Sue Mosey again with Midtown Detroit, hoping that you've been enjoying panel series. And we hope to see you back again tomorrow night for the next edition of the panel discussion.